Hey everybody! Today's conversation is a bit bigger picture and less LDS specific, but I wanted to start by sharing an anecdote close to home. So last summer, I was walking around BYU's campus in Provo and I noticed a familiar sight. These little flocks of teenagers moving from building to building with lanyards around their necks, clearly part of the church's summer youth program. These days it's called For the Strength of Youth, or FSY, but when I was 14 and attended, it was known as EFY, especially for youth. And I noticed something. The boys and girls were not linking arms. That might not seem like such a big deal, but at EFY it was practically a ritual. You were expected to escort someone of the opposite gender between classes and activities, elbows linked. It was one of the most intensely awkward and unforgettable parts of the week. The thrill of being chosen, or the panic of working up the courage to ask someone. Trying to make small talk when the only thought pounding in your brain was how sweaty your elbow was getting locked inside theirs. It was so cringe, so unnatural, and so formative. Now, I haven't found an official reason for why FSY dropped this tradition. Maybe it was complaints about how uncomfortable it made people, maybe a shift towards just focusing more on Christ rather than heteronormative bonding. Maybe it was to avoid alienating queer teens, or maybe it started as a COVID thing and just stuck. But here's what surprised me. Without the arm linking rule, you might expect kids to just mix freely, walk with whoever they wanted, no matter the person's gender. But what I saw was the opposite. The kids were walking in tight, gender-segregated clusters. So there was a group of girls up front with a group of boys trailing behind. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but it felt like a small reflection of something bigger that I've been hearing social researchers talk about, which is that even as we've moved away as a society from rigid gender expectations, men and women, especially young men and women, don't seem to be mingling more with each other. If anything, they're pulling apart. Some sociologists are calling this gender polarization, a growing divide where men and women differ not just in behavior, but in how they vote, how they talk about relationships, and what they want out of life. Young people especially are showing more suspicion of the opposite sex, and many researchers point to social media, online echo chambers, and fewer cross-gender, in-person friendships as part of the problem. So what's going on here, and why, when the rules are relaxed, does cross-gender connection get harder, not easier? For most of my life, if you had asked me to vote on whether to continue the practice of linking arms at EFY, I would have emphatically voted no, like please discontinue this. But now I'm starting to rethink that and wondering if maybe some of these low-risk, chaperoned, cross-gender, and yes, to some degree, unnatural rituals, whether it was linking sweaty arms at EFY or waddling in the dark at youth stake dances, might have had some social benefits beyond just preparing for marriage. So I shared this anecdote with Daniel Cox and Kelsey Eyre Hammond, who are researchers at the American Enterprise Institute, and they have been tracking shifts in young adults' beliefs, behaviors, and relationships. So I shared this story with them, and this is a conversation that ensued. I hope you enjoy.
We're listening to The Soloists. It's just me today. Mallory wasn't able to join us. She's out of town this week. And I'm joined by two, I'll just call you guys friends and colleagues in DC from the American Enterprise Institute, and Daniel Cox and then Kelsey Eyre Hammond. Welcome. What from your research, what do you see exemplified in that little anecdote of walking around BYU's campus last summer? I guess, and in what ways is that situation like maybe a metaphor for what's going on between men and women across American society?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I think the way you described it as, uncomfortable or cringy, I think that's endemic to a lot of human interaction, particularly between men and women, particularly between men and women who don't know each other or know each other well. And I think one of the really critical things that's missing now is opportunities for young men and young women, boys and girls, to spend time in the company with each other, and not just so they can further, romantic possibilities, but I think also just to learn to be in the same space, and opportunities to share their experiences and how they sort of move through the world and the problems or challenges that they have in ways that aren't really so threatening, right? So like, uh, I think in one way there's something that's really nice about the idea, despite the fact that it will create discomfort and maybe feelings of cringiness among some of the young men and women who are forced to link arms. It will also force you to try to, you know, engage with someone, right? Like it would be awkward just to sit to do that in complete silence. And so like I think it kind of pushes you in that direction. And I think at a time when so many young people are withdrawing either to online spaces or just withdrawing completely from activities or relationships or connection in the real world, I think a push in that direction, even if it's done in a little heavy-handed way like this, I think incredibly would be incredibly helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I don't know if
it's
Kelsey, if you feel it any differently as thinking about some strange boy escorting you around campus.
I mean, yeah, I also attended, for the for the listeners who don't know, I'm also LDS, and I also attended these camps. Um, and I didn't, yeah, I think the worst part of that was mostly just that it was summertime and it was Utah, and it was always such a sweaty experience. But but I agree with Dan. I agree with you that like sort of forcing a little like a level of discomfort is actually probably good. Not, you don't want anyone to feel you know, like they can't get out of an uncomfortable bad situation. But I do think that I remember experiencing the escorting around BYU campus as a 15-year-old, and I I think it actually does. It helped. I think in my experience, the boys a lot more than the girls. The girls were generally more social anyway and more interested in engaging, and so we were kind of fine. But there were many times where I was walking for a good 10 minutes next to like some awkward 14, 15-year-old boy who never interacted with women, and it probably, I hope, was helpful for him to get out of his shell a little bit. I'm sure he probably hated it, but like I would imagine that in the long run, like looking back on it, he was probably like, oh yeah, it's probably good for development. I don't know. And we do see that like among Gen Zers, that they're experiencing their life experiences are a little bit like delayed. Things like dating and having a first kiss, things like that are all a little bit later than millennials and older generations. And so I mean there are probably a lot of different reasons for that, but it does, I think that's a part of this as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think too, there's a way in which the culture has changed so much that this maybe even in the LDS community, but certainly outside it, that this kind of forced interaction would be a kind of tough sell. That concerns around microaggressions and that social
Yeah.
interactions can lead to lasting harm.
Mm-hmm.
The embrace of those kinds of ideas that social friction is somehow bad and we should only do things that are completely comfortable, I think is a huge part of the problem, because no social interaction is going to be completely free of risk or possible embarrassment or discomfort, and the things that are really worth doing carry those kinds of risks. So asking someone out, um, trying to befriend someone, offering to help, asking for help, right? So all these kinds of ways of interacting, it may not work out well, and I think that the way we should be modeling this stuff is that we teach young people that even if it doesn't work out, even if it is a little uncomfortable, you will benefit from the experience.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And that's part of the reason why I love this, this anecdote as a way of thinking about what's going on in our culture, because it's so low stakes. But it's also so visceral. And like Kelsey, you're talking about the sweatiness. Like, yes, that's what we would always end up talking about, is how literally sweaty your elbows would get as they were hooked together as you're walking across campus. It was such a visceral experience. And so, but like so low stakes, right? Like
Yeah.
maximum 3 or 4 minutes, and then the week is gonna end, and then you're never gonna see these people again unless you like them, in which case, and so to go through these, to practice social interaction in a way that was supervised, I mean, I don't know, I assume maybe you could have an awkward conversation, but lasting harm, I don't know, it's all so chaperoned, so supervised, and yet it's like it's giving you these the routine points of practice, And so, yeah, there does seem like, have we thrown the baby out with the bathwater or something, or maybe prioritize the wrong things and always wanting to make people feel super comfortable. Anyway, there's a lot going on there. So in addition to this sort of this desire that you've named that we have to sort of retract and withdraw, and maybe out of concern and empathy, sometimes maybe overplaying the amount of harm that some of these mundane situations can bring, there's also just the fact that men and women increasingly seem to belong to different worlds. And in part this is fueled by just not interacting as much. In what ways are we seeing men and women grow up and develop ideas about each other in different sort of social universes, and what is causing that? I know that's your whole book. How do you just jump in? But
Yeah. So I think a lot of this takes place online. So the type of gender segregation that you're talking about, I mean, there's a way in which, boys and girls, at least in the US for a long time, that they would, you know, pretty typically segregate themselves, right, based on interests, and the girls wouldn't want to play the boys because they were being too rough and loud and noisy, and the boys wouldn't want to play with the girls because the girls were playing games that they were less interested, sort of more relationship oriented games, perhaps traditionally. And so like there'd be some amount of like based on interests and preferences that, right, like boys and girls would go off and do their own thing. You see this at my kids' school, and sometimes the kids, boys and girls, are playing with each other, but oftentimes the boys are doing one thing and the girls are doing the other. So like I think some of this is not particularly unique, right? There's going to be some amount of this, but I think what is new is the extent to which the world of social media is taking boys and girls, young women and young men, on very different journeys and exposing them to very different types of information and conversations. And so you're not developing an understanding of girls and women from personal interactions, from what you're seeing in the real world, but from caricatures of various behaviors online, what people are saying. There's a whole podcast industry that seems to revolve around the denigration or criticism of women or men. You do see it, I think, more among men than women, but on both sides, there's some kind of easy targets out there. I mean, there's plenty of examples of men and women doing things to each other that are not particularly laudable. You see this a lot in the dating context when men are behaving atrociously. We can certainly talk about some of the examples that we've heard and from various folks on that front. But I think there's nothing that is in the long term that damaging about that if you have a really sort of socially engaged life out in the real world where you're seeing women, you're seeing men, you can sort of separate. Yeah, I understand that online I'm seeing this really negative behavior and women talking about sleeping with hundreds of guys and men bragging about how many women they slept with and how they don't care and they mistreat them and right, kind of manosphere stuff. And I think it's a lot harder to dissociate that stuff if you don't have examples to challenge it in your real life. So if you don't have regular interactions with women as a boy or young man, it's like, okay, yeah, this is how women actually behave. This is what they actually think and believe when it comes to dating and relationships and friendships. And the stuff online is a kind of perverted version of that, or an unrealistic representation. So I can separate that. But if I'm coming of age, I'm on social media by 10, 11, 12, and this is what information I'm using to come to these conclusions about the way women act and what they care about and what they value, and they only they care about is money, and that's really damaging because your entire worldview is then shaped there, and then you are funneled to these toxic groups that just validate and reinforce these negative views, and it can happen on, for both women and men, but I think we see it more strongly occurring among boys and young men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kelsey, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that Dan largely covered it. There's just one example I would add is just that in addition to, exposure to a lot of, thoughts and ideas that are sort of abnormal because of social media, things that we might think of as sort of niche, like extreme misogynistic positions on things, or, things like that, that a lot of people think are very niche, but then you go and you look at a YouTube channel and there's like a couple million people following this person, or, something like that. In addition to all of that Dan kind of touched on, there's also just a pretty normal algorithmic validation of all of these things. So, I think I've noticed this a number of times, and I've seen people talk about this online as well. Like, even comments on videos on TikTok will be catered toward who's watching the video. And so, you could have 1,000 comments and 500 of them are on the side of the woman in the video sharing her experience, and 500 are on the side of the man who she's talking about. And me as a woman, I will open those comments up and I will see all the comments that are on the side of the women. And then I'll send that video to a man I know, and that man will open up the comments, and all of the comments will show men who are saying, oh, this woman is so wrong, And so that definitely doesn't help when you can sort of create a worldview, or your worldview is created by and validated by like things that are just algorithmically catered to your already existing perception of things, if that makes sense, or what you should or shouldn't think based on your gender, And so I think that's also a big part of it too, is like, in addition to just exposure to more random, sometimes niche, sometimes not niche opinions about things that maybe, a 13-year-old boy or a 13-year-old girl hasn't had enough life experience to decide for themselves if it's true or not. There's also just a validation of kind of a first instinct of like, me as a man, I think this woman must be wrong, and look, all these other people agree with me. That is also unhealthy.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So getting into a little bit of the details here. So we're talking about like different sort of internet echo chambers that are not only segregate, like have audiences largely of men. And it's interesting that you said that this is largely like the manosphere thing. I'm curious if there's an equivalent thing for females, or if we think of it that way. But then, so it's not only like the audiences are segregated, but also the content that they're talking about is the other gender, right? So it's like both a segregated audience, and the issues and topics that they're talking about are why this segregation exists, and why people aren't connecting. What are some of the different arguments that you're hearing young men and young girls imbibe about each other, if you were to dive into the details?
Kelsey, you want to start off with this one?
I mean, yeah, you can feel free to correct me or fill in anything I miss. I think I obviously have my own biases as a young woman. I have a tendency to sort of defend other women, as many young women do. But so that's why I give Dan permission to correct me if I'm off base here. But I do think that a lot of what we see, and this is, I think, what we've seen in interviews as well as some of our survey data, like open-ended responses to questions that we've asked, especially, is a lot of women seem to be more fearful of their physical safety or their emotional well-being being hurt. Like they're worried about being verbally or physically abused. They're worried about someone taking advantage of them physically, all of that. And men are also worried about being taken advantage of, but in like a completely different way. They're a lot more worried about being rejected. There's a fear of rejection is very high among young men, and also just a fear that like a woman wants to go out with them just for a free meal or something is like something that came up even in focus groups that we did. We saw women being like, oh, I'm worried a man is going to take advantage of me physically, and the men's group saying like, oh, women are just always trying to get a free meal, And a lot of those fears are based on perceptions that exist of the gender as a whole, right? And so I don't know if this kind of answers your question, but I think that is a big part of it, is that there's this perception that the majority among women, that maybe the majority of men are interested in taking advantage of me physically in some way, and a perception among men that most women, or all of these women out here, like want to take advantage of me financially or reject me or something like that. So anyway, Dan, I'll let you fill in.
No, I don't know if I have a lot to add, but it's these same type of stereotypes that have been around for a long time. When you think of like the idea of a gold digger, someone who's only interested in men for their money or their status and position, and not really interested in the whole person. And I think for women, much the same way, so that the men are only interested in sex and not developing a relationship. And I think that Kelsey talked about rejection. I think online dating has made things somewhat more complicated there, where I think the average experience of men on dating apps is one where there's a lot of rejection, like that you're being very active, right, and trying to cast as many lines as you can out there, but a lot of them are you're not finding any success, and women will actually be inundated with requests, and I think that kind of feeds into these these ideas that women have more power, and they don't use it in ways that are pro-social, that they are kind of in it for themselves. And so that on either side you have this view that people are sort of selfish, and only care about what they care about, which is a really tough place to start in a relationship, right, where you need to have some amount of trust to move things forward. And I think we're working with a pretty significant deficit at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. There's these shared perceptions that the other side is selfish and self-interested and has no actual interest in them as people. And then it sounds like the types of vulnerability that they both face are real but kind of invisible to each other, right? And this is such an interesting thing about the dating apps, where any individual only has their experience on it, right? But it is kind of interesting to have data that reveals like a real point of vulnerability for men, and what that must be like to experience rejection over and over again, and in a way that women don't. And yet that fear that women have of walking alone at night, right? That classic thing that people talk about. It almost feels like a gift of the magi problem, where I don't know if you remember that story, where a woman sells her hair to buy her husband a chain for his watch. He sells his watch to buy a comb for her hair, and they like just missing each other. But I mean, there seems to be something like that going on. And then, of course, this is affecting much more than just dating interactions. This is also something that, I mean, when we talk about gender polarization, often it's associated with this talk about gender political polarization. Do you want to say just a few comments on that and what people are referring to that way, and how these perceptions of the other gender are affecting the way people vote and think about society and these larger cultural questions in the atmosphere?
Yeah, no, I think the political divide is a critical piece of all this, but I think in a way it's downstream to some of the cultural differences that you see, uh, when it comes to things like attitudes around marriage or views of organized religion, views, and trust in a lot of various institutions, so higher ed. I mean, what we often hear, and then what is revealed in a lot of the data, is that both sides have this increased wariness of these various critical social and civic institutions, that they're serving the interests of women but not men, or men but not women. That you have a majority of single women in a recent poll that we did believe that single women are happier than married women, which is not borne out by any data that I'm aware of. But nevertheless, as a perception that single women have, that marriage benefits men much more than it does women.
Mhm.
That parenthood is something also that many young women are wary about. That this is a situation that will be particularly disadvantageous to women, particularly those interested in a career. And so, whether it's organized religion, which a lot of young women also believe is, if not patriarchal, certainly doesn't treat men and women equally. And it's not hard to see where those views came from. And then in the education space, you see that, that whether it's elementary school or higher ed, that these institutions are looking out for and promoting the interests of women, but not men. This is something that we hear about again and again and again. And so if you kind of have that worldview, you can see the way politics can quite easily intercede and become a critical dividing line between them, right? So if Republicans are like, yeah, the experience of men are like, you're what you're feeling, what you're seeing is valid, that these institutions are kind of arrayed against men. We've come too far in our attempt towards gender equality, and we need to kind of reassess things. And you'll see a lot of men saying, yep, when Trump's saying the Me Too movement may have gone too far and we need to worry about young men, this plays into that. So you have the political parties kind of aligning on either side. On the Democratic side, you see conversations and arguments about, well, we actually still have significant gender inequality in the country, and reproductive health care and abortion are critical issues, and women are increasingly vulnerable there. And so you have kind of parties aligning on either side. So we're saying, okay, we will represent the interests of men, we will represent the interests of women. And that's kind of what's going on, where you see this dramatic decline in political identification or democratic identification among young men, and women remaining firmly democratic over the past decade. And it's not as if we've seen this dramatic ideological realignment. So on issues of same-sex marriage or abortion or marijuana legalization or premarital sex, right, that young women and young men aren't that far off in those. And in fact, they mostly look pretty liberal. But when it comes to views of the political parties, you are seeing a pretty stark divergence.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. It is just kind of interesting. So I mean, my short career has been in the pluralism diversity space, working with religious diversity, and increasingly I'm like, is gender the point of diversity? Like, do we need to take that frame that we were having, in my workplaces, that we were having towards different cultures and different religions? Is that the kind of frame that is needed for like the way that we think about gender, where we come in and instead of like this insistence that we are on the same page and that we understand each other, instead we need to actually say like, okay, we don't. And that's obviously tricky to do in a world that conceives of gender difference as fully constructed, and this idea that any place that highlights gender difference as essential or important, or is just going to take it as like a necessary feature of the room, is that kind of framing can already be seen as on the bad side by some. Like that's conceding to the view of men and women is fundamentally different. And anyway, it just does seem like there's something here where, whether you want to see it as constructed or natural differences or what, this is like a big division, and it almost feels cultural now. I guess that's the point of calling this like a gender polarization, is increasingly these are not just men and women of all sorts of different cultures having it's just they've become like almost like cultures in themselves with their own kind of worldviews. And obviously that can be overstating it. It's not like that is going to speak for all men and women everywhere at all times, and it's not like we have no capacity to still see each other and dialogue together. But I just am increasingly wondering if that dialogue frame that I've sort of like used in other contexts is kind of what's necessary here. But just on that note, what do you think could be done that would help this?
I think you have to start with acknowledging that there are differences between men and women, right? Like something that I think should not be that controversial. And I think it's difficult because with overlapping distributions, the tallest woman is much taller than the shortest man, right? Like there are women who are stronger and taller than men, right? But on average, men are stronger and bigger than women. And so I think like you have to argue about averages, and that can be
Mhm.
difficult to do because someone can easily drop in an anecdote or an example, sort of saying, "Well, this isn't true in this case," right? But certainly when like Kelsey's talking about safety, right? Like that's an issue because of, men are more aggressive, stronger than women. They present more of a threat to women than women to men. And I think if you start there, it becomes easier to sort of say, well, there are other ways in which women and men are different. You can argue, well, this is because of socialization, or this is because of physiology, or just developmental stages where we see differences. But I think like without that acknowledgement, it becomes really, really difficult to advocate for any particular solution. Because point of fact, even in elementary school, you can sort of see boys and girls need different things to succeed. Not every boy, not every girl, but on balance, you see that the interventions that would help boys are going to be somewhat different than the interventions that would help girls. And I think there's been such a rush to, in the effort to promote gender equality, which obviously, is incredibly important, a move to sort of say any difference can lead to judgments about better or worse, rather than just different. And I think we need to sort of say, no, we don't need to make comparisons about which of these is better or worse, but we do need to be clear-eyed about ways in which men and women learn differently, socialize differently, have different physicality, and different interests. And then we can take it from there, right? Then we can sort of start from the same page, and acknowledge that there's something we can do for both boys and girls, and young men and young men.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that too is just that this is sort of, I mean, this is like me on my sort of like soapbox about gender. But like, I think for a really long time, when you look at the history of, the fight for gender equality and for feminism, a lot of like late stage kind of feminism has been about women becoming more like men. Women start wearing suits to work in the 80s, and they start, like doing all these things. And I think we're now at a point where that's, maybe there's sort of a balance there, where because men, like Dan said, men and women are different and have different strengths and things like that. Maybe part of the solution is just both men and women understanding the other better, and then figuring out what strengths they lack that they could learn. In addition to women learning how to kind of like lean in and be girl boss, like strong, there's also space for men to acknowledge, like, oh, perhaps this like more feminine leadership style is actually better. Perhaps I should learn how to be empathetic from my mother, just like I learned how to mow the lawn from my dad. Or, no, that's a bad example, but I think that that's also a piece of it, is that I think there's what you talked about in kind of assessing gender from a like diversity standpoint, and wanting to have diverse perspectives like you do in your work on religion. There's also a value in creating spaces that are co-ed, that are celebrating differences. And I think that that's a place where like the younger generation could maybe lean into, I think, because I do think we see a lot of discourse about like, okay, I want this women's only space where I'm safe from men. And I think that's good and that's fine. But I also think that like even women who aren't interested in marrying and dating a man could still benefit from learning about how men think, and how, and men who are not interested in marrying a woman can also benefit from understanding how women think and understanding the strengths that women in their lives have. And so I do think that like it doesn't, not every, for a long time, the main goal between men and women interacting was so that they could be married and have children. And that isn't necessarily a shared goal of society anymore. Sometimes for some people it is, and for some people it isn't. But I think it's important to acknowledge that there's value in that gender diversity that doesn't just mean people getting married and having babies. Like there's a lot more to it than that.
I do think that Kelsey, like having children is so fundamentally puts women and men on the same page, right? Like that it gives them purpose and a goal to share, right? Like even if they are contributing in different ways, that marriage and particularly starting a family, I think there's ways in which that's incredibly important as an opportunity for men and women to appreciate the other person and share a really important life goal. And I think, man, seeing my wife be pregnant and deliver 2 kids, nothing makes you appreciate what women go through and the things that they do and all the ways they um, look out for other people than, seeing my wife become a mom it's incredible. And so I think I would hope she would say something similar about, me being a dad, but I think that it wouldn't happen without us having kids, because I feel like there are so few experiences like that. It's not that this is the only way that men and women can get on the same page and really learn to value each other. But I think it's an important one, and I think one that we're increasingly seeing is becoming rare.
Yeah. Well, yeah, again, to use like dialogue or pluralism frameworks for this, like it sounds like the way that you just described having children is sort of that common ground approach. Where's something where you can come together for a shared purpose or project? And that's like one of the big ways that you try to build understanding across differences. So it's really fascinating. It feels like, and I read this in your research about the way that single women assume they're going to be happier just without men in their lives and without marriage. And it seems interesting that there's a little bit of a difference between women and men this way, where women's response to some of these things is like, I'm just going to do it alone. And men, it feels like the direction that kind of culture is turning is women should give us space, let us in, and this harkening back to a more traditional type of marriage thing and wanting to preserve those institutions. Anyway, it feels to me like there might be an imbalance here where women seem like they need men less than men need women, which is this fascinating reversal of like what it must have felt like 100 years ago, you know? Anyway, does that seem accurate to you? And I guess what would you say to people who are like, yep, the other gender, they're like so off, I don't even want to engage, and I'm going to just do life alone?
I mean, I think because of technology, that goal is more easily realized than ever, right? Like, if
Yeah.
you have resources, there's so much, if I need to repair something in my house, if I'm having you know an issue with my car, right? There are professionals, there are people you can go to. More than ever, there are, across any kind of domain, there are professional coaches, there are therapists. You can hire someone on TaskRabbit to put a shelf up, right? Like, you can have your groceries delivered. There's so many ways that technology has shifted the balance of need from people in your, real people in your social circle, friends, family members, a partner, to outsource it. And so it becomes a lot more reasonable to think that, yeah, I could do some of this stuff on my own. And actually, I
Mhm.
have, great friends, and I don't need a partner. And I think for some people that's eminently true, but for others, I think that's definitely kind of a fallback position. That's not their ideal position or preference, but it's one that they're accepting because they cannot find the right kind of person, right? Like, it's consistent with what we're seeing in the data, with 50% of college educated young women saying that they can't find a partner to meet their expectations. And so what the heck is happening there? Um, and I think that answering that question is a key to a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll never forget, I thought about this all the time. I was traveling in Alaska last summer on a solo trip. I've done plenty of this solo stuff myself. And, but that's irrelevant to this point, which is I was in a museum it was just like a small town museum. And there were all of these diary entries from some of the earliest residents. And I just remember I took a picture of it because I was like, life has changed, of this woman who had wrote in her journal, I married this man because I needed running water. And I was like, "Whew, yeah, there you go." And, all the way from there to now exactly how you said, TaskRabbit, Instacart. You not only don't need to get married to get your basic life needs met, you don't this collaborative approach has been so dispersed, right? You don't
Yeah.
even need to talk to the cashier anymore. Like, just human interaction in general is just so much more. There's so much technological distance between us and other human beings. This seems like a big piece of this.
There's a way in which, expectation about what a partner or spouse should provide has changed, right? Like from your example there, the expectation that woman had about what her partner would provide is pretty clear, right? Like she wanted running water. But now it's not just the running water. You want everything. You want someone to contribute financially, be there emotionally, so be a good companion, um, fulfills his sexual needs, right? So it's all these different things that partners and spouses are now required to meet. That in some ways, it's no wonder that so many people feel that people are falling short. And for women who get divorced, that's one of the key reasons that they cite, that their partner was not living up to their expectations, or that they thought they were doing, bringing much more to the relationship. And perhaps that they were, but perhaps another solution would be like, well, what kind of other people could be brought in, so that we don't rely so much or perhaps exclusively on our partners and spouses. And I think like that is something I think worth reckoning with. And David Brooks even wrote about this a while back, about how the nuclear family has basically failed us, right? It's
Mm,
we weren't meant to live entirely by and for our immediate families.
yeah, right. So just to yeah, to add on that, it feels like there's this problem that, you first described where we literally don't need each other to get by anymore. But then on top of that, sort of like the absence of these practical needs to collaborate, there's just like this almost like a spiritual or very romantic impulse for your partner to be like a soulmate or an endless conversation buddy, and to fulfill all of those like much more diffuse, hard to define, and certainly hard to fulfill kind of emotional, spiritual realms of life. That's really fascinating too.
I've definitely heard people talk about that, particularly in feminist spaces, you know, that are trying to give women permission to sort of say, hey, it's not, you don't have to stay in a relationship that you don't feel is right for you, right? And that makes perfect sense. But it's really interesting to see at a time when so many women say they can't even find a guy who's kind and committed and caring and has a good job, that women who say like, I've got all these things and not for me. And that's right. That's totally, to each their own. But it seems like, sort of dissonant conversations. We're having one conversation over
Yeah.
here, another conversation over here. And we're seeing really different things.
Mhm. Which I think just speaks to the importance of your research and why I'm excited to follow it. Because, yeah, I totally agree. It feels like there's these developing different universes for how we think about each other. And then there's also how we're actually acting and responding. And I mean, I just, yeah, I do think there's dissonant conversations here, and dissonance between reality as it's actually playing out and then the stories that we're telling about it. So anyway, I'm really grateful for your time, and it's just for me just a point of greater inquiry, and I'm so grateful for your work. I'm excited to follow it and to just keep asking these questions and figure out what's going on. So anyway, thank you all. Thank you both
Yeah.
so much. This has been
Enjoyed
great.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we love chatting with you.
Well, hopefully we'll have more opportunities in the future. When is the book coming out, and what can people expect that way?
So the book, I think at this point, this early stage is due for a publication date, fall of 2026.
Uh, Book publishing is just so long term.
Different time frames than most everything else.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I highly recommend the Substack that it's a is it Substack or is it a different American Storylines
Yeah,
with Daniel
Mhm.
Cox and Kelsey, you're a frequent contributor as well. Um, so yeah, highly recommend that to follow the conversation along the way. And thank you both. We'll
thank
talk
you.
soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening, everyone. If you would like to continue the conversation with us, we invite you to subscribe to our Substack. You can find us at thesoloist.substack.com. That will allow you to get an email in your inbox every time we release a new episode, and you can click just directly on the links to the readings and the things that we're watching, reading, and thinking about.
It also allows for easy two-way conversation with us. Hearing from you all is honestly the best part. No matter how cliche it is, I know every podcast says that, but it's really true. So please subscribe, and we'll talk to you soon.